Hello and welcome to the Love Mia Vita podcast, sponsored by Fem Pharma. I'm Jerry DiPiano, founder and CEO. Thank you for joining us as we discuss all aspects of women's healthcare. Please note, this podcast is for educational purposes only. Always refer to your healthcare practitioner for personal advice. Hi, Dr. Juliana Hauser. We're so happy to have you again on the Love Mia Vita podcast. Dr. Hauser is a frequent guest. She's part of the medical advisory team at Fem Pharma, and she's also become a friend over the years that we've been working together professionally. So a double bonus. And Dr. Hauser, Juliana, perhaps you can share a little bit about your background for those that haven't tuned in before.
Well, it's always great to be here, Jerry. And I'm twice licensed professional counselor, licensed marriage and family therapist. And I have my PhD in counseling education from Women Married. And I have a private practice, and then I do lots of speaking engagements. And I have area of expertise in sex and sexuality, in menopause and mental health and relationships.
Thank you. Quite a background. And for those of you that want to learn more, you can go to Dr. Juliana's website. Dr. Juliana Hauser is, as she said, eminently qualified to talk about these subjects. And today we are going to talk about connection. And it really comes right from this book, which I happen to have, A New Position on Sex, A Guide to Greater Sexual Confidence, Pleasure, and Authenticity. And in Dr. Juliana's book, she talks about connection as really, I would say, one of the most important frontiers, because it sort of encompasses most everything that is included in her book. And I strongly recommend reading this book. I did, and that's why I feel excited to talk about Pillar 9, connection. But Juliana, let's dive into this a little bit. What is connection? What's your definition of connection, and why does it matter?
Yeah, I thank you for reading the book and for giving us a chance to be able to talk about it. When I was going through finding the 9 pillars of holistic sexuality, part of the work that I've done in the past few years is getting the order right of how you go through it in order to self-examine who you are as a sexual being. And connection was something that had to be a part of it. And it's really for me where my work as a therapist is intersected with my work as a sex educator. That in my work in private practice, what I've seen is people can live a long time in pain, but they can't live a long time without connection and purpose. And for most people, their purpose is defined through connection. And it may be connection in a relationship, it may be with the community. And in the chapter, I talk about pets and supporting teams. What I've learned is it really doesn't matter who the connection or what the connection is with. It's that you have one and the quality of that connection. Because ultimately, I think connection is telling you that you matter, that your presence here on earth matters to somebody or something, and that you feel like you have a place in the world. And it's the details are different depending on who you are and the details of your life. There are people that it's one or two things that they feel intimately connected with and genuinely feel like they are seen and wanted and heard, as the truth of who they are. And that's what they need, and they feel very fulfilled. I've talked about the word fulfilled versus satisfaction for a long time. That's to me, contentment and fulfillment are really what I help people find in their life. And I think those things are found through connection. And if you can open up your definition of what connection is, then I think it gives you a much greater way of beating the loneliness epidemic and also finding your place on this planet and the time that we're in.
You said something earlier about people living in pain. You can live a long time in pain, but you cannot live a long time without purpose. I'd like to dissect that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I And I was surprised about that realization in going through my practice, because I would see people in such dire situations, and I still do. I mean, there are times that I leave sessions with clients and my heart is broken and shredded because of how someone's been treated or what they're facing, and how just how hard it is to be a human at times. And yet I see resiliency matching that level of pain. But it changes when someone feels not lost in the world, but lost in who they are and lost in their place in the world. So it feels like where that leaps from pain, like emotional pain, to the I can't handle being here pain, is if they don't see that it would matter to anybody or anything if they weren't there the next day. And that is it's a realization that I think a lot of humans have to face and have to work through, as opposed to this is a really painful time, this is a painful chapter or season in my life. It's not fun to go through that, but it doesn't seem to have the same tugging effect in an existential crisis as deep loneliness or lack of connection. And I think an important part to tease out in that too is some people will say like the loneliest place is to be in a crowded room, or the loneliest place is to be in bed with a partner that is you're not connected with. And I would add to that, it's very lonely to not know who you are, and or to have people connecting with you but they're not connecting to the truth of who you are, so that you can't really receive somebody wanting you and somebody seeing you and valuing you because that they're not connecting to the truth of you.
So it sounds like you need to you need to develop that sense of self-awareness so that
Mm-hmm.
you can form that connection with another individual or with a pet.
That's right.
You do talk about a pet. I'm a dog lover, as you know, so
Yes.
a lot of dogs, have had a lot of dogs, have a grand cat. And pets bring us joy too, and they don't ask for much. If we can talk about human connection
Hmm.
and self-awareness, or really an understanding of who you are and what you bring to a relationship, because I'm feeling like that's your purpose.
Hmm. I agree. I if and I've been asked this, what do I think people, our purpose is on earth? And I think part of the answer is to know who you are, to know the truth of who you are, and to know that that is not a one-stop shop, that is a continuous experience through our timeline and our lifespan. And that if you can look at that endeavor in curiosity and fun, and humility too, because there's parts of us that we have to learn that aren't so pretty and aren't so wonderful to know. But it's the 360 of us that I think that is so crucial to having that experience of being comfortable in your own skin. To me, is that's a very that saying is speaking to that. Like, know who you are, and 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 know all of who you are, and feel good about the complexity of us, and offer that to other people and other things, and be a person who can handle someone else's complexity as well.
You also talk about this, so I know we're continuing to delve into this even more as it pertains to holistic sexuality. And you say in your book that it requires the deepest and most profound level of self-knowledge, and it requires authentic self-reflection. Because let's face it, we could
Mhm.
superficially say, well, a lot of times we define ourselves by our roles, whether
Mhm.
it's as a parent or whether it is a daughter, mother, sister, or we define ourselves by our occupation. And that really
Mhm.
isn't true self-reflection. These are roles, but it's really not the essence of who we are.
Mhm. They're glimpses into our talents, to our skills, or just where we've kind of just slid into life. But it isn't knowing what someone does for work, or what they're doing tonight for an event with a friend, gives you clues, but we have quite a society that values performance and values, promotes masking and not letting ourselves be really seen. And I have to say that even writing this book, I can teach all these things. I've been teaching this for 20 years. But when I had to really put my work behind, like put myself behind that, and I made the decision to give personal stories in this book, I thought, okay, well, there are going to be people that know things about me that they normally would have never ever heard. And I'm not going to be able to give the complexity of the context of the stories because the book can't be 1,000 pages long to explain. It goes into a paragraph, and leaving my mom and I had some discussions about some of the stories in the book already. And and I and yet, what felt important for me in this book was to show what it's like to give a one-way vulnerability, to show what it's like to examine yourself and say, okay, so here's not a so pretty part of me. Here's a part that I don't feel great that that's what I've done, or that's what I've experienced, or that's how I've behaved. And also, that's the truth of who I am. And I'm learning and I'm growing. And I think when you can do that and have that level of authenticity, then one, it makes you so much more approachable. And also, it when one person gets vulnerable, it becomes contagious in a relationship, in a room. People want to share the truth of who they are. They just don't want to be judged for it. And they want to know that what they're sharing about themselves is going to be accepted. And that's the rub of this: is if you really want to be in a true, authentic connection, you have to know who you are. You have to be vulnerable and risk take in sharing the truth of who you are as you know it to be. And you have to be able to take care of yourself no matter how one person or other people respond to it. It's a good lesson to feel vulnerable and also know that it's my responsibility to self soothe in that vulnerability, and hope that in my ability to stand in the judgment or the acceptance of it, that will allow people to connect with me. And it's a little hard to connect with an author through a book, but not always. Depends on how vulnerable they are in that too. I had a version of the book that was strictly memoir, and it was nothing but stories of mine going through all the pillars, a lot less teaching and no client stories. And it was a lot more vulnerable. And I got lots of feedback from literary agents and publishing houses that it was too much to be that vulnerable and not relatable in a lot of ways, and that people wanted to be taught instead of wanting to hear everything about me. And yet I had probably half of the people who were my first ones saying, I just wanted more stories about you. I just wanted to hear, I wanted to learn more about you, Juliana, and less teaching. And I, that in and of itself was a lesson of connection, because ultimately, when I had a wider range of opinions about what to do with this book and what stories to share and why to share them, it ultimately came down to, how well do I know myself? How much do I trust myself? And then I just have to let it go and let the connection speak for itself with people, which I think that happens on a day-to-day basis in our work, and just walking on the street or in the grocery store, in our most important conversations, and in our sexual behavior.
It came across, so I obviously I read the book, and I really love the blend of your stories,
Great.
because the vulnerability does speak volumes about who you are and why you can make that, I'll use the word connection, with your clients. So informing that connection, you said this early on, vulnerability is really important. Authenticity is really important. And as we get closer to those that we care about, it could be a friend, it could be a love interest, the absence of that makes it really challenging to
Hmm.
sustain that relationship, right? I mean,
Hmm.
superficially, it can work, but at least in my own experience, the more I can share with other people and be vulnerable, the more I notice that the relationship will either sustain itself because that person will then reciprocate by being
Hmm.
vulnerable and authentic with me, or they won't. They will maintain the facade, and that means that there's really no connection to be established for the long haul. So perhaps we can talk a little bit about that, because we, when we develop these relationships, sometimes they work and, they are relationships that we have for life. And by the way, you don't have to establish them when you're 10 years old. You can establish them when you're in your 50s or
Mhm.
60s or even beyond that. And they work to the end of your life, or sometimes they break down in a matter of years. And just had one that somebody I thought I really knew, was a female friend. I thought I really knew who she was. And then I realized that she was communicating with me at a very superficial level. And
Mhm.
that's not who I am.
Mhm.
That's not who I am, because I was very vulnerable and very deep. And so it's probably not going to be a friendship that will be sustained.
Mhm. And I think that's um I mean, it's always really, it's hard and it's disappointing when you have the opposite of connection and have an experience a disconnect, even when you know it's right for you and it's, this is not a relationship that is good for your soul and good for your future. Is the experience of a disconnect with somebody can really be devastating. And also experience resiliency in that, even just the way that you're speaking about, there's a mourning and a grieving of this, but there's also like an assurance of like, I know who I am and I know what I need. When you say, and that's not who I am, like I am not a superficial person. I think there's also a celebration alongside of that. And I think there may be a disconnect with somebody else, but a reconnection with yourself in that process that is important and very authentic. And I think it informs you about your other relationships and also moving forward. I think it's really common in this age too, especially we talked about this in our 50s and 60s. It's a time of like, I don't have time for the stuff that doesn't work anymore, regardless of what it is. And in the places where you have ability to have agency in this, then you do want to cut those friendships, those ties, or you want to change your work environment, or you want to move, or whatever, or it's time to start having those kind of experiences. I think it's very freeing. It's one of the top things people talk about, especially for women in 50s on up, is like, I'm ready to live authentically, and I am not willing to care nearly as much about what people think about the authentic part of who I am. So that means ending relationships sometimes. And I think about I hope it's okay to talk briefly about us, but I think that's how our relationship has grown, is that we made the choices to be authentic when we're not recording as well.
Yes.
And to like to share things and to say like, what, this is what I experienced, or this is what I'm going through right now, or like I have to cancel this because of this has happened in my life, or whatever that is. And you never really do know how someone's going to respond. And when you're not in someone's day-to-day space, you don't know the context of where they're going to be hearing this too. And I think we both um, wanted to share authentically with each other about what's happening in our lives and who we are and what we've experienced. And it's such a thrilling thing when you meet somebody and you're like, you too, like, oh, or like, no way, Jerry. And I'm still waiting for that picture of you. You know what I'm talking about, of you in that phase of life. I get it as a therapist, but that's not my total role, just to listen to stories. But when I get to just sit back and hear about somebody's life, I don't, it's part of what gives me purpose, is hearing how people matter in the world and what matters to them.
Interesting. When I have found someone that I form a connection with, I I perceive that there are some physiological changes. And when I read
Mm,
this in the book, so I don't want to say you feel giddy, but you definitely feel I hate to say this, a buzz. And when I
mhm.
read that in the book, I was like, okay, I have not had anything to drink or smoke or anything of that nature. So the buzzy thing is not, artificial. This is really,
Yeah.
something special. But you talk about that in the book.
Mhm.
You say that you talk about feeling buzzy. And I
Yes.
and I got that. I really relate to that. So let's talk about, so is there a physiological change that you experience when you just know that you formed
Yeah.
that connection? And by the way, we're taking this out of the context of sex. So we're not talking
Yes.
sex.
Right. And traditional sex acts, which is
Exactly.
part of what I do a lot of work in the book, saying that when I'm talking about holistic sexuality, sex acts is one of the pillars, but it's only one of the nine. And so when we're talking about connections, a lot of this book isn't even talking about sex acts. It's talking about holistic sexuality. And you're right, because I think when you have that experience of meeting somebody, and it's and to me, especially if there's no sexual connection associated with it, and you are just vibing or buzzing, or you're just feeling like, whoa, like this is great. We have such ease. And to me, that is often that you are feeling seen and wanted and valued in that connection, even if it's just one conversation. It's somebody wanting to hear you. They are seeing, and they're in wonder of the story that they're sharing, or what you're experiencing about them, and they're valuing you, what you're sharing, and who you are, and who you are to them. That there is, in my opinion, nothing better than having that trio effect. And Brene Brown brought that trio to the forefront, but the mental health community was using a lot of that before she put it to the mainstream. But I give her lots of credit for bringing those three words out into the vernacular, because there's a lot of wisdom in it. And there's some variations of those three words, but I think when it boils down to it, it really is some version of feeling wanted. Sometimes that's sexually, but a lot of times it's outside of that connection. Like, I want you to be here. I want to be talking with you. I want to share this with you. And then I see you. I see the truth of who you are, and the complexity of you. And and I really value all of this, and value my time with you, and value your place here in my life, and here on earth. And when that happens, you've got all these hormones releasing, all these chemicals releasing. And I would relate it to what happens, when a mother and child are bonding, that there is that chemical release. And it's part of why some groups, and maybe even some people, have had a cautionary tale of misunderstanding that the meaning of what those physical feelings are. And especially if they're happening within a sexual connection, there some people could interpret it, because of their flooding of hormones and chemicals, as it meaning more emotionally, and mattering more. And that trio has a continuum of all three, and you may misunderstand where you fall in that continuum to the other person, because of how you're feeling connection. But when you don't misinterpret, when you are feeling it, it's to me what I think people describe as soulmates. That's how I define that. And I have talked to enough humans to know sometimes a soulmate is your romantic and sexual partner, and sometimes it's a best friend, or a child, or a pet. And I don't think I would say sporting team would fall into soulmates, because I do talk about how important that is, and it can be for some people, but just not that level of intensity. But I am thinking of somebody now who has not found a romantic love that has fulfilled her in that way. And she said to me, I think it's my best friend. I think my best friend is my soulmate. And we're not going to be sexual, but I think I'm not sure and she's heterosexual. I'm not sure that any man is going to be able to match the level of connection that she and I have. And her friend is married and has a really great relationship, and a wonderful guy. And so she was asking me, like, so why? Why does she get both? Why does she get a soulmate and a partner, and a soulmate in me? And I don't get that. And I don't necessarily have an answer for that, but I think it does speak to it's like one of the ways that conversation progressed was connection like that brings you safety. And safety, I think, is also a part of that trio of, if you feel wanted and valued and seen, then you feel safe. You matter. And when you feel like you matter, you feel safe. And when you feel safe, you feel better about being authentic, about the truth of who you are. And you want to risk take it. It becomes this beautiful synergetic experience and cycle that happens. There's also the reverse, the negative, and the opposite of that. But when you can get into the positive loop of it, it's, it's life altering, and it changes the quality of your life immensely.
I do I do like the distinction that you make in the book too about sexual connection different than sex. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess the question, can you engage in sex without connection?
Yes. It's where you fall on the
Intercourse, let's
continuum.
say connect,
Yes. Yeah.
intercourse. Let's talk intercourse. So
Yeah.
can you have sex or engage in sexual intercourse without connection?
I think ultimately everything is a connection. But I think that if you were to like have a continuum of what your quality of connection is and your meaning of the connection of that, there are plenty of people that I know that have had, penetrative sex and not felt any kind of meaningful connection. And how someone interprets that is very different. So the context of that. So some would find that to be, feeling like assault, or feeling that to be very violating. Others would be like, oh, it's empowering. I don't want to have an emotional connection to this, but I feel sexually connected and I feel authentic and I'm not performing. And I'm very clear of the guardrails of what's going to happen before, during, and after this. And for those who are clear about that with the person or people that they're being, sexually connected with, I find that to be not damaging at all in their mind. And they feel, excited and empowered by the concept and the consent of that. And I've had other people that think you would never feel in any way connected to be sexual with somebody that they didn't feel another kind of connection with beyond the sexual aspect. And there are people who feel that having a romantic connection or an emotional connection feeds the quality of the sexual connection. And I believe everyone in that. I think I have seen it all and I have heard it all. And I think one person can experience all three and the variety of that. And I think some people fall into different categories. I'm not sure I have felt, I've had somebody that never wanted to have more than just like a primal sexual connection with everybody. I've not come across that. But I have had people say, oh, yeah, I wanted one thing and that's it. And it was great. And I feel very good about it. And I don't know the person's name and I don't need to. And feel really wonderful about that. And I have other people that will speak in lengths about it would never feel good if I wasn't in love. And if I didn't feel loved, I couldn't feel safe. I couldn't, move into that. Or the difference of having like primal sex versus loving sex is so different and does something different inside of me. And I prefer that. I've heard that quite a bit too.
But it does come back to what you said in the very beginning of this conversation, which is knowing who you are. So being
Mm-hmm.
self-aware. So if you're the type of person that feels because, whether it's cultural or religious or ethnicity, whether those are the factors that play into who you are, that prevent you from feeling that you must have love or connection in order to have sexual intercourse, assertive sexual intercourse,
Mm-hmm.
versus somebody that knows, hey, you know what? I just have, certain desires. They can be satisfied this way. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
need to have that. This is who I am. And it's really okay. I'm okay with that. And as long as the person that you're connecting with is on the same page, then it may make sense. So it comes back to
Mm-hmm.
the self-awareness aspect of all of this stuff.
That's right. It does. So to know who you are and know what your yeses and nos are authentically, and to know how to communicate that if you're connecting with somebody else. Yeah. And being able to hold their yeses and nos. All of that's what determines the quality of connection in the moment and in the debriefing afterwards and the meaning making that you make of it, all of it afterwards. And my role when I'm working with clients and when I'm speaking about this is I like to educate that there's a variety of ways to be looking at this so that you can choose. Because sometimes knowing where something's a no is much more informative to you than about who you are than knowing what your yeses are. It's a give and take on both of those. But I always want people to embrace their no's as much as their yeses, because it means you're knowing who you are. And when people show up authentically, you live better lives and more fulfilled lives, and you're content. The second thing I would say is, people can, in addition to people can't live a long time without connection, is when somebody begins to live an authentic life, the ripple effects that it has in their life and then the people around them is enormous. You just start making better decisions, and you know how to have more resiliency in the life and the decisions that you're making, which also has ripple effects to the people around you. And for some people, that awakening and that understanding is within a sexual relationship that has to do with sex acts, and sometimes it has nothing to do with that, but it's because it's an endeavor of knowing who you are. They're very much tied. So if you do the work within who you are as a sexual being in your active sex life, and you're authentically learning who you are there, it will absolutely bleed into the life outside of sex acts. And if you're doing this work outside of sex acts in a sexual relationship, it will absolutely bleed into your life and your sexual life. And so, as much as I say that holistic sexuality is the truth of who you are and the core of who you are, it is also there is an element that is bifurcated, that feeds each other and informs each other, that you want to understand that, because who we are as sexual being is it's one of the hardest places to know who you are authentically, because of how confused our culture is. So if you can figure that out and be authentic, and you have learned such a huge muscle memory, it's the difference of, like, weighted vests are such the phase right now. It's the difference of learning how to run a marathon with a weighted vest on, and then running it without it. It has built a muscle memory that you don't unlearn just because you're not in that context. And so learning it within who you are as a sexual being is crucial.
It does take us to something else that you described, which is self-love. And you talk about there being innumerable types of love. And we've covered some of those in this conversation. Self-love does make the list. So it comes back to knowing who you are and really accepting yourself for who and what you are, right? And treating yourself like your very best friend or soulmate, as we described. Because let's face it, sometimes we're harder on ourselves, and we don't treat ourselves with the same type of love and respect that we do with people that we love. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
what's not on your list is unconditional love. And I do think that it's worth
Yeah.
having that conversation.
What did you think of that? I'm curious.
I agree with that. I don't believe that there is unconditional, well, maybe with your dog or your cat or something
Right,
like that,
right.
right?
Yes, yes.
Because we do know that they just give, unless they're biting you. But even when they're biting you, could be because they've had trauma. But with a human being, I don't believe in unconditional love,
Mm.
because that
Yeah.
basically sets us up for abuse, and that
Hmm.
is not a good thing.
Yeah. And I do have it's a hill I'll die on. Is that I don't I agree with you wholeheartedly that I think the phrasing unconditional love is dangerous in some circumstances, and so thusly it's just something I can't embrace, because it sounds like the goal is to love no matter what. And I think you have to go back further, which is, how are we defining love? And I tell you, it was one of the hardest sections in this book for me to write. And I wrote a little bit about, because I would write like 5 pages and they would cut down to like one paragraph. There's a lot that has been cut out of what I wrote when I was trying to work through all of this. And when I got to the section on love, one of the things that was hard was even including love in this, because there's been, a lot of organizations that have really hurt the context of love and sex, and made it be, something that has, if you don't have love within sex, then you're bad and it's bad. And so but then, because there's, such harm being done in that philosophy, I did know that I had to write about it. Then I was like, what is love? And I was like, oh God, I'm so trite. How many songwriters and poets and authors have tried to define what love is. There's thousands of songs, and who am I? Who am I to try to figure out what the definition of love is? And I sat on my porch a couple times going like, I don't even know. But when I did know that I had to figure out some way to communicate it and talk about it, I was thinking, if we're talking about love truly being how you are seen and wanted and valued, if that's a pretty clear definition of being loved and loving somebody, then seeing them is also seeing all of the complexities of them, which I said earlier, which a lot of us have parts of us that if it was recorded or shown to the public, it would be like, ooh, not so great in that. And that doesn't mean that you aren't lovable, and it doesn't mean that you're not loved, but it also doesn't mean that you have to be accepted. And I think that's how the word unconditional love has been misunderstood, that people think it's unconditional acceptance, and then love becomes weaponized in that. And I think that, an example with children, that you can love your kids and they've done something terrible and awful, and you can still love them and be there and see them and value them, but you're not accepting the behavior. And that's the difference of, like, in parenting, that we know, like, I don't love that behavior, but I love you. There's the distinction. But I think when we become adults, unconditional love becomes weaponized of, it's supposed to be the same thing. If you can't accept all of me and accept the good and the bad, and don't let me off the hook, and if you make me behave and you make me grow and you have requirements and standards, then you don't love me. I hear that a lot, and it is always in the context of an abusive relationship. And so I can't get behind it. Could I sit there and argue about, what is love and what is unconditional? Yes. And I certainly see that, like the phrase that I use in my family is, when somebody is the most unlovable is when you need to love them. And that's usually like when one of my kids is just being a complete asshole, or, like, they're really hard to like. And that's what I'm talking about. It's the liking part of it. And there's a difference between liking and loving as well. And I think that loving somebody actually means not accepting poor behavior, and loving yourself means not accepting poor behavior. And we all know the difference of where that line is. What the difference of you're being abused or you're being abusive versus you're not acting right, and you need to change. And so I've just made the effort through the years to say to people, I don't believe in unconditional love. And it's rarely a benign response. A lot of people disagree with me on that, but I stand firm in it.
I don't think that I don't think self-love is selfish. And therefore I don't believe that unconditional love works for me. Now that's just my personal belief, which is why I agree with you. So the
Mm-hmm.
selfishness part doesn't play well for me. You need to love yourself first. I use the expression filling up your cup. If your cup isn't full, it's not possible to share it. And not liking a person is actually okay, or not liking their behavior, which is what you said earlier, is part of that trifecta of, you're self-aware, you know what you like and what you don't like, your yucks and your yums. And that also means that you can communicate that to your partner or to your friend or whomever. And that is your authentic self. That's part of who you are. Maybe they don't like
Mm-hmm.
that part of you, and that's okay. Then that's not valued. So we come back to valuing you,
Right.
right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And maybe that relationship no longer sustains itself. Mine did it. So
That's right.
we parted ways.
Yeah. And me too. And we've talked about that too. I've experienced that as well. And I think unless you've experienced an abusive relationship, this topic may not feel as much of a hot button, or you may not be able to experience the danger of that concept versus the beautiful wonder of what it does feel like when you've behaved poorly and somebody has stayed, and somebody still wants you, and just basically saying, do better. You can do better, do better. That is beautiful to experience that. I but I don't see that as unconditional. And I still feel like that has a condition as an aspect of it, because I think sometimes loving somebody is leaving, and loving yourself is leaving too. And I love the way that you spoke that about self-love, and being able to end things is an act of self-love when it's not serving you, or it's not right for both of you in that experience. And I think too, like, that's some of the biggest damage that I see in relationships that are unhealthy, and especially abusive ones, are the are or like the relationships that the abuse is centered towards, like narcissistic abuse, where it is about harming the truth of who you are. That the self-abandonment is the biggest wound oftentimes, versus what the other person has done. It's the grieving that happens, like when I'm working with somebody, or even in my own life, of like, wow, I put up with that, or how did I get in that situation, or how did I stay for that long? And it can take a long time to get out of a relationship like that. I was given permission from a client to share this if it ever felt relevant. And I know two people who have had the experience of a mother who their son was narcissistic and was absolutely abusive to them in their relationship. And that is a very lonely club to be in, because it hits, you can't divorce them. There's no legal ritual to this. There's a lot of standards that mothers are held to, of being unconditionally loving to their child no matter what they're experiencing. And the grief they have of losing, the importance of being a mother, the grief that they have of going against cultural norms to be safe and to protect themselves. It's the ultimate act of self-love. And mothers are already so often judged as being selfish, that it is a conundrum that is filled with so much shame. I'm not sure in this population I've ever been more worried of the safety of a woman than a woman who has a child, especially a son who is abusive towards her. And because they don't have a lot of avenues in which to leave, and there's not a lot of role models, and people do not talk about it, and yet it happens so much more than you'd realize. And so having the ultimate act of self-love, and that can mean the ultimate act of not loving as a traditional mother would have. And that's a tough road and fork to choose in this fork in the road. And yet on the other side of all of that, regardless of what that relationship is, when you choose yourself and you don't self-abandon, there is nothing. We talked about how great and buzzy it feels to have a soulmate and to connect like that. It's not the same buzzy feel, because that's more like an endorphin rush. But when you leave and you have left, I mean, sometimes in the leaving it's not so great, but in when you have left, and when you've looked back, whether you've ended a relationship or a romantic one or a sexual one, and you have shown up for yourself because you know who you are, there is no deeper, richer feeling, which is why you have to prioritize self-love. It's the most important relationship you have. And we have heard that bumper sticker psychology forever, and yet it's unavoidable. And believe me, I actually was like, I do not want to have to write a chapter on self-love. I mean, there are so many books about that. Like, what more, who needs to hear that anymore? And it was absolutely unavoidable. I just had to. I mean, ultimately, and I took it out, but at one point I was like, I think looking at who you are as a holistic sexual being may be the ultimate act of self-love. And I'm like, that's too much. But I actually believe it. I do think that. And I think I've seen so much harm and hurt that has come from people's sexual lives, and so much beauty and wonder when there's a positive sexual experience or relationship, that I think ultimately it is determined by how well you know yourself, and that you don't give up in knowing who you are, no matter what age you are. And I think if you've had any conversations with somebody over 80 that is examining their life, the majority of people that I've spoken to, one, they'll say they don't feel it, they don't feel their age, and they can't believe they're that age, or whatever it is, whatever that age is. And they feel in their soul this vibrancy and zest for life, and think, but I don't know if my physical body is going to give me what my emotional body wants to have. And to me, that's the vitality of longevity too, is knowing who you are and being deeply connected to the truth of who you are, and doing the work to continue that, and not giving up hope in yourself, and not giving up hope in the world. Because I know in my deepest, darkest times, it may have been hard to reach me in telling me it's going to get better, or that I'm going to feel happy and great and, celebratory again. But every time it has. And so every time I get through something hard, I would tell myself, remember this laughter after that storm. Because when the next storm hits, you need to have a lot of proof that it is going to improve. And if you really hit it head on, you make it something. Like, I'm not someone who believes in looking for silver linings and awful things. I just think sometimes things are just shit sometimes. And things, I'm not sure. Believe that things happen for a reason every time, but I think you can make a reason out of it and figure out something from it. And I think one of the most valuable things you can do is learning who you are because of that. What have you learned about who you are because of it? And if that's what I get from it, it's not it's how great it is that I've learned something different. Sometimes it's like, didn't have to be so hard. I wish I could have learned it a little easier, but I use it for the good moving forward. And 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 then I think ultimately, without getting too like woo woo about it, is I think if we're really looking at connection and we're looking at who we are as humans, it's figuring out how your connections move you forward, and where you're heading in life. And because sometimes as humans, it just feels like there's no control and what's going to happen, or you feel like a lot of other factors have more control over you and what's determining in your life. And sometimes that's true, but you have control over how you experience you and how you experience the things that are happening in the world. And I think that's good news if
Yeah,
if you embrace it.
absolutely. Connection at all is something that is so important to us. We've heard that this is, we have a crisis in terms of how we deal with other people and how we form relationships with other people. It can be very lonely, especially when people transition their careers, or when they transition from being parents of children to now parents of adults, or when they lose their parents, right? Um, but connection has to be formed out of love, self-love, starting with self-love. And there's a quote in your book, and I want to read it as the culmination because this really resonated with me. Love combines agency, self-knowledge, and self-compassion.
Hmm.
I think that is the essence of forming connections that sustain you and serve you.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that
Great
statement.
quote. Love that. Love that.
Oh,
So, Dr. Juliana Hauser, thank you so much for joining
and thank you, Jerry.
me on the Love Me Avita podcast. It's always, I always learn something new when we have these conversations. And I hope those that are listening and watching have also learned something. More to come. Dr. Juliana is a frequent guest on the Love Me Avita podcast, a medical advisory board member, and my friend. So,
Oh,
Dr. J, Juliana, great to see you again. Thank you.
I'm so grateful for our connection.
Take
Yeah,
care.
I love you too.
Thank you for joining us on the Love Me Avita podcast. Love Me Avita means love my life, and that is a mantra we should all live by. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and remember to follow us on social media and on fempharma.com. Thank you, and be well.